Good afternoon and welcome to today's IAC webinar, Introduction to CT Radiation Safety. My name is Kelly Bear and I'm the Creative Design Manager with Marketing Communications at IAC. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to review a few technical matters and let you know how you can participate in today's session. We would like today's webinar to be interactive, so we encourage you to submit questions. To do so, use the Questions tab located on the left side of your screen. Please submit your questions anytime during the webinar, as we will be monitoring questions throughout the presentation and will try to answer as many of them as possible during the Q&A period. Also on the left side of your screen is the Resources tab. Click this tab for a link to today's handout, a PDF copy of these PowerPoint slides. Select the file name to download the handout. Lastly, in the lower left of the player, please note the Request Support button. If you experience any technical problems during this webinar, click this button. A technical expert will be there to assist you with any issues you may have. For those who like to take notes during the presentation, look to the right of the slides and click the Notes tab. There you will see a white text box where you can take notes on today's webinar. These notes will be emailed to you automatically at the end of the session. To be eligible for the ASRT CE credit, you must be registered, logged into this webinar, then complete the survey. The survey will appear on your screen automatically at the conclusion of the live session and also be available from the IAC webinars portal for 3 business days. If you are viewing this webinar in a group, please be sure you are also individually registered and logged into this webinar on another computer or device so that we have record of your attendance today. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be posted at a later time for on-demand viewing. This webinar is a joint presentation of IAC and ASRT. And now I would like to introduce our guest presenter, Bill DeForest. Mr. DeForest is Vice President and General Manager in Imaging Physics for Landauer Medical Physics in Glenwood, Illinois, currently serving on the IAC CT Board of Directors representing the American Association of Physicists in Medicine. He is an AAHP certified health physicist and is ABR certified in diagnostic radiological physics. As a medical physics consultant with over 30 years of experience, he specializes in radioactive materials licensing, radiation protection, regulatory consulting, and accreditations including CT, MRI, ultrasound, mammography, and nuclear medicine. And we are happy to have him with us today. And with that, I will now turn this webinar over to Bill DeForest. Bill?
Hello, everybody. Thanks for attending and joining us. I will point out a couple disclosures about myself. As Kelly mentioned, I'm board certified in imaging and in health physics. I'm on the AAC Board of Directors, and I do consult to OEM cone beam CT manufacturers, and I do work for Landauer, and we do work for a lot of IAC customers and people seeking accreditation. And also, Landauer does offer a 3-hour CT rad safety course online that you can use in complement to this credit for continuing radiation safety credits. So as we go forward, just really quickly, this is what we'll cover today: the nature of radiation, radiation terminology, sources of radiation, biological effects of radiation, radiation risk and benefit, occupational exposure, personnel monitoring, protection from radiation, radiation in pregnancy, and describing CT dose. So this will be a sort of a primer in radiation safety as it applies to CT. So you may ask, what is a medical physicist? Those of you that are accredited probably know a medical physicist and have had a medical physicist in your facility to do the various things that are required for accreditation. But AAPM puts out this information about a medical physicist on the website. It's an applied branch of physics concerned with the application and concepts and methods of physics, the diagnosis and treatment of human disease. It is allied with medical electronics, bioengineering, and health physics. What's our scope of practice? Well, essentially, it's the responsibility of a qualified medical physicist in clinical practice to assure the safe and effective delivery of radiation. And this is what we're going to talk about today to a degree. And a medical physicist performs and supervises the technical aspects of procedures necessary to achieve this objective. So why is radiation safety training required? If you're IAC accredited or seeking it, you'll see that there's a requirement for this. So let's talk a little bit about it. We want to learn the concepts to reduce personnel and patient exposure. We want to address questions from patients. How do we address questions from patients? How do we allay their fears about radiation? It's also required by 10 CFR 19, Code of Federal Regulations 19, Title 19, and state regulations. And it's also good practice to periodically update your knowledge and address important radiation safety topics. And lastly, it's required by the IAC for CT accreditation. So why are radiation safety, dose, and quality concerns to me? Well, CT is a significant source of radiation to the public. There have been articles in the last 10 years from the New York Times that really altered public perception around CT. Patients ask a lot of questions. Certainly, if you've been a practitioner using CT for some time, I'm sure you've had questions from your patients, from your family. I get questions all the time. Should I have a CT? I heard it's dangerous. Is it really as risky as we think it is? So it's good to get an idea about the level of risk and what's really going on here. There are increasing state regulations regarding CT too. Some states don't have specific requirements for CT, but others do have very specific requirements, and it's good to understand what the radiation safety and dose aspects are. There's also a lot of flawed science out there for marketing purposes, a lot of misinformation that vendors might use, that people might have preconceived notions about. It's important to put these things in perspective, both for ourselves and for our patients. And the last part is that cone beam CT is now very common in many specialty and medical and dental practices. So this has increased the use of CT in general. And cone beam CT is CT. And so there's an awful lot of CT machines out there in current use in medical and dental practices. And so it's good to address the concerns around CT. So just really quickly, let's look at the two different kinds of CT that there are. In Figure A, you'll see a medical multi-detector CT. And in Figure B, more a typical cone beam CT. And both we will consider CTs and are covered by this accreditation. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between cone beam CT and multi-detector CT. Cone beam CTs have a field of view that's reduced to just the region of interest, just the head, and in some cases, an extremity. It is optimized for a special purpose only, and so imaging is optimized for one purpose and does very well at it. It usually has a lower dose than multi-detector CT, or what I sometimes call a full gantry CT you see in a hospital or in a medical practice. It has higher spatial resolution in general than a medical or a multi-detector CT. It's got a very small size compared to a multi-detector CT. It has lower scatter than a full CT, a multi-detector CT, and it's lower cost. And so we see an awful lot of these out in practice. What are some of the disadvantages of cone beam versus a multi-detector CT? It has poor contrast resolution than a multi-detector CT. So it doesn't differentiate between various tissues as well as a multi-detector CT does. But in some cases, we don't care because we're working on a special purpose. Are we just worried about bone and air and maybe water? It might be fine to use a cone beam. But if you're going to have to differentiate between many different kinds of tissues, then a multi-detector CT would be better. CTs also have an inaccuracy of CT numbers, and you don't get the ability to specifically identify certain tissues that you would get in a multi-detector CT. There is some geometric distortion that we call the cone beam effect, and scatter is still significant and higher than many machines they replace. Sometimes in a dental practice, they would replace a panoramic unit, for example. So let's just compare these two different kinds of CT very quickly before we get into radiation safety. In the multi-detector side, we could operate between 80 and 140 kVp. 120 is pretty typical. In a cone beam, between 80 and 120. The focal spot sizes are about the same. We have multiple detector arrays in a multi-detector CT, such as maybe up to 320 rows of detectors. And in the cone beam, we just have a flat panel. Our spatial resolution is about 0.5 to 0.625 for a multi-detector and can be about 0.4 for cone beam. So a little bit better spatial resolution, but notice the contrast resolution is down to 1 Hounsfield unit or 1 CT number on a multi-detector, but could be 10 or maybe a little higher on a cone beam CT. So not as much contrast resolution, the ability to separate tissues of similar density. Okay, let's talk a little bit about why we're doing this. A lot of front page headlines that came out in the New York Times and in other publications, as well as picked up by the Evening News, about that maybe CTs do more harm than good because of the radiation dose. And so there was a radiation boom, a series of articles in the New York Times saying that the public dose to CT is creating a lot of cancers and a lot of deaths. Okay, so we got a lot of concern about that. And that science is a little flawed. There's a lot of information about CT dose that's published by respected groups such as the NCRP, National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements. And in this report, number 160, the ionizing radiation exposure to population in the United States, it details some of that information. So if we look at 160, NCRP report 160, we can look at 2 different time periods. If we look at the early 80s and we look at when this was published, which is in 2006, which is a little dated now, it's probably a lot bigger actually, we can see that our pie chart on the left in the 80s is very small. That's reflective of the dose in the 1980s. And in 2006, that pie chart's much bigger. So you'll see that in the 80s, most of the dose received by the general public was due to background radiation, just natural radiation that we're exposed to. And we'll talk about that a little later, about 83%. And only 15% of it was due from medical. Occupational is even a smaller piece of the pie. But in 2006, you can see that background only represents only 50% now. And that 48% of the dose we get is from medical radiation. And that amount of radiation, total radiation a person receives, is higher. So let's look at the change in contribution from CT. We're talking about CT, so let's drill down to CT. So when we look at the early 80s exposures on the left, we can see that most of the medical dose we received is from just straight X-ray radiography, planar radiography, and fluoroscopy, about 68%. And that computed tomography was only 3%. And if we look in 2006, we can see that computed tomography is almost 50% of all the dose that was received from medical radiation. So it's increased quite a bit. And so this is part of the reason we're talking about radiation safety in CT. Here's some of the information on the estimated number of collective doses from various medical imaging modalities. And so you can see that that the number of procedures has increased dramatically, and that the collective dose for CT has increased dramatically over time. And that's really the take-home message here. So annual growth, CT procedures in 1993 were less than 1% of the U.S. population has CT procedure annually, and now 10%, over 10% get the CT procedure annually. And so there were, 2006, there were 62 million CT procedures in the U.S. And it's important to note that pediatric CT, and we'll talk about dangers to pediatric patients, was 8 to 10% of the total procedure. So that's significant as well in terms of radiation safety and the impact the public dose. So our medical radiation exposure in the U.S. population has greatly increased since the 80s, and most of it's due to CT. And that's the part to take home here, is that there's been an increase in total number of procedures, but CT has certainly dominated the landscape. With that background on CT radiation dose and why it's of concern, let's talk a little bit about the specific types of radiation that we're talking about. There are 2 kinds of radiation that we're exposed to every single day: ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation. And they're very different. So ionizing radiation contains sufficient energy in the radiation to break chemical bonds, particularly in cells, and can especially affect DNA molecules and cause damage to DNA molecules. And Examples of ionizing radiation that we're used to seeing in medicine would be X-rays and gamma rays. There are other kinds of ionizing radiation, such as betas and alpha particles, that we're exposed to naturally and occupationally in some cases. But for the purposes of our talk today, we'll stick to basically X-rays. And gamma rays are very similar, but at a higher energy in general than X-rays. Now, the other kind of radiation is non-ionizing radiation, and it can produce effects in cells, but those effects are thermal effects and don't break chemical bonds and don't affect DNA directly, but they can affect cells. And so examples of this are MRIs, microwaves, lasers, use of cell phones, things like that are non-ionizing radiation and have different sorts of effects, but not effects that can break chemical bonds or create ionizations in cells, positive and negative ion pairs. So X-rays are part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And electromagnetic spectrum is where visible light is. And we can see light because our rods and cones are sensitive to electromagnetic radiation in this range. But of course, we can't see X-ray because it passes right through our retinas and we can't detect it. So we don't see that. Okay, so X-rays arise from interactions within electrons, primarily produced by radiographic equipment or fluoroscopic equipment, or CT, in an X-ray tube. Those are man-made X-rays. Some X-rays do arise naturally in some radioactive materials. I should point this out. Gamma rays arise from interactions within nuclei produced by radioactive materials. So if you're working in medicine, you may know about nuclear medicine. So in nuclear medicine, we will use isotopes such as technetium-99m or thallium-201. These are gamma ray emitters as opposed to X-ray emitters. They're both photon radiation, and they both interact in the cells in similar ways, but X-rays are generally man-made. We're going to talk quite a bit about units of measure in this course, and you'll, of course, interact with your patients and with your equipment, and you'll see readouts of amounts of radiation, so we should review the terminology for units of measure. When we talk about Rankins, or capital R, we're talking about exposure in air, which is really charge in air, how much the charge in air the radiation produced. If we were to step into that charge in air, we'd absorb some of that radiation into our cells. And if we absorb 100 ergs per gram, we would call that a rad. Okay, so some people think of that as radiation absorbed dose. Rad, or AD, radiation absorbed dose. And it could be specific to an organ or one part of your body, or it could be specific to your whole body. If we talk about the damage that a rad might do to us and its ability to produce a medical event such as a cancer, we would talk about radiation equivalent dose, or a REM, which you can think of as radiation equivalent man, which isn't exactly what it means, but it's a great way to think about it. In our unit for a rad, in traditional units, is the rad, and in SI units or international units, it is the gray. And 1 gray equals 100 rads. So it only takes 1 gray to have a huge rad impact. And in REM, it's a sievert. And we'll also talk about millisieverts and millirad, which are 1,000ths of those units. For the practice in healthcare facilities with X-ray, a rad is about equal to a REM, is about equal to a Rankine. They're very, very similar. Small amounts of radiation are described in millirankin, milligray, millirem, milligray, millisievert. So we'll see often those terms used more frequently than grays and sieverts. Those are a lot of radiation. And it makes more sense to use a smaller unit, such as a milligray, to describe medical radiation exposure in dose. For CTs, we'll also hear CTDI, which is Computed Tomography Dose Index, and many of your machines will read out dose in CTDI. Remember that it is not the dose to that patient specifically, it is a index, and the index is based on dose to a 16 or 32 centimeter phantom, but it is not exactly the dose that patient gets. It is a way of comparing the dose that different patients get and the magnitude of dose, but it's not exactly the dose those patients get. And that is in terms of effective dose, or millisievert, and it's a calculated number. It's calculated by the machine. If you use the same protocol on 3 different patients, you will get the same CTDI value. but the dose of that patient will not be exactly the same. That will be dependent on the size of that patient. So a little bit more about effective dose, our middle gray. It is the absorbed dose times a weighting factor. And the weighting factor is determined experimentally and is based to compare carcinogenic risk from a localized exposure to the massive data for the whole body exposure. So sometimes we'll see cone beam manufacturers, in particular, quoting dose and effective dose, which is misleading because if I only, for example, irradiate the head, then my risk of cancer to the whole person is much less than if I irradiated the whole person or a larger portion of the body. And so people will quote effective dose of these very, very low middle grade numbers when the dose to the head or the body part is much higher in this case. And so there's a weighting factor for each organ. You can see gonads are 0.2, bone marrow 0.12, the bladder, breast, and liver are 0.05, and so on. And so you would take the dose to that body part, multiply by this little fractional number, and that would be the weighting factor for the amount of risk to you or a patient as a person from that exposure. But it is a little misleading. So let's talk about natural background radiation. I touched on it, that it was the major component of our dose back in the 80s, and is only about less than half of our expected radiation dose every year now. Sources come from the ground, terrestrial, from cosmic radiation coming from outer space, remnants of the Big Bang, if you will, or internal in the food we eat or the things we ingest that food is picked up from the soil. It's variable by location. It's not the same all over the U.S. The largest single source is radon. We breathe it in, breathe it out. We can't avoid it. That's very variable locally. It can be around 200 millirem a year to your whole body effective dose, and about 2,000 millirem a year to your lung as the actual dose. Again, the weighting factor comes into play here. Our typical natural background radiation, excluding radon, so we had 200 any of these, would be about 60 millirem in the Northeast, East, and West and Central states. Go about 45 in the Atlantic and Gulf Coast states, and much higher, like in higher elevations like Colorado and the Colorado Plateau, about 120 millirem, plus our background from radiation on top of that, from radon rather, on top of that. And again, this is just another slide illustrating it, that we have cosmic, terrestrial, and internal sources. A pie chart that explains it a little bit graphically, that you can see the radon emanating into the home on the left, a little bit of cosmic. Some of the food we eat, such as bananas, have potassium 40 in them, and the 15% typically is medical, and that's growing. It's much higher now because of CT use, really. Again, this is a sort of a duplicate slide, but just again, ionizing radiation, don't forget, can break DNA chains and break bonds, and non-ionizing radiation cannot, but it can produce thermal effects. So if cell phones could present harm, it's due to thermal effects. So what kind of effects does radiation cause? So the BR7 report, which is a report about atomic bomb survivors and conclusions based on risk from atomic bomb survivors from World War II, which is where most of our data comes from, has summarized the radiation effects. And it says that radiation effects are indistinguishable from those effects that occur without radiation exposure. Cancer, skin reddening can happen for various different reasons, and you can't tell from that a cancer was induced by radiation in particular, or that a burn to the skin was produced by radiation or some other thermal effect. There's only slight exception to this is cataract formation, which is a risk in radiation, but radiation will generally only produce posterior cataracts, whereas those can also occur naturally, but that an anterior cataract would generally not be caused by radiation. So you can tell a little bit on cataracts, but other things not so much. Radiation effects are inferred from statistical excesses of cancer induction, for example. We see out of millions and millions of people exposed in atomic bomb blasts, a slight increase in cancer risk. And so we infer radiation risk from that. But remember that, and it should be pointed out that of all the things that could cause cancer, radiation is not particularly effective at producing these effects, although it can be described statistically. The two different kinds of effects that we see from radiation are stochastic effects and deterministic effects. Stochastic effects is where the severity of the response is the same regardless of dose, and the only probability of having that response is affected. So the more dose you get, your risk goes up, but the severity of response, if you should have it, is no different. And here we're talking about cancer induction. So there's a risk of cancer induction from any dose, at least in terms of what we expect in radiation protection, but the risk of that cancer goes up with your lifetime dose. But the effect would be the same regardless. A deterministic effect is where the severity of response is directly related to dose. And there's a threshold below which there is no response. So a great example here would be skin erythema or the loss of hair, for example, with, in the picture on the right, it was caused by a CT protocol that was not correct. Sort of a famous picture. And so you would have a certain level of onset. It would be a very, very high dose. You would have a direct and deterministic effect that you can quantify. So you can think about stochastic effects as like a chance, for example, then 1 in a million that you will win a lottery ticket if you buy one ticket. So and that would mean if I bought more tickets, I might have a higher chance, but it would still be a really low risk. Deterministic effects would say something like, if you miss 2 days of work, you probably won't lose your job. But if you miss 200 days of work, you'll probably lose your job. There's sort of a threshold there. And so those are the two different kinds of effects we see in radiation risk. If we look at stochastic effects and we look at biological effects, and this is a dose risk model, we assume that at high levels, we know what the risk is. And these are from atomic bomb blast survivors. This would be the solid line that is sort of to the upper right of this graph here. And down in the occupational levels, and even where patients mostly are, we're down in this lower left-hand corner. And we do know that the known effects are true. But at low risk, we don't know. We don't know the shape of that curve. And so we assume that it's a linear response all the way to zero. Now, there are some people that will argue with that. But if we protect at this level, we know we will never be in a position where we're underprotecting somebody. And so all our regulations and everything that we do in radiation safety is based on that nonlinear threshold model. There is no threshold, and it's linear. Risk and benefit. So we feel that ionizing radiation is overwhelmingly beneficial, right? And we use it in medicine to diagnose and to treat. It's a very effective tool. And we have to weigh out the risk. And so we can CT improves diagnosis, treatment, and outcomes clearly. On the other side, we could have skin reddening or cell death or hair loss or an increased risk of cancer. But overwhelmingly, the benefit's much greater than the risk. But we want to reduce risk as much as possible. So that introduces the concept of ALARA, which is an acronym standing for as low as reasonably achievable. So regulatory limits establish safety for occupational workers. And although patients have no regulatory limits, we do have guidelines and guideposts. So lower dose carries lower risk of cancer. And so we want to be reasonable in how much dose we give. And what's reasonable? It refers to the cost and societal factors. Lowering dose may add cost and time and things like that. But reasonability might be different for different situations, facilities, and exposure scenarios. So it's important to keep in mind that we should be reasonable. Would it be reasonable to have zero dose around a CT unit? Probably not. It would take a lot of lead. It would take an awful lot of care to have almost no dose. And plus, for a patient, you'd have a pretty horrible looking image. So you have to be reasonable. You have to balance out the dose and the risk and be reasonable about it. If we're talking about occupational exposure, and I think we really are here with this group, we're talking about three different cardinal principles of radiation protection: time, distance, and shielding. We want to reduce the amount of time we're near the source of radiation. So we don't want to be around that source of radiation in the room with the CT. We want to increase our distance from the source of radiation. So we want to step away from the CT or the patient when we're being exposed. Now, we shouldn't be in the room to begin with, but if we had to, we would be further away. We want to use shielding to protect ourselves from the radiation. So if there's a situation in a in any kind of CT or radiographic situation where we have to be in the room, we'll wear a lead apron, protect ourselves from the scattered radiation or direct radiation. Certainly the scattered is what we want to be exposed to only, not the direct. And we'll use shielding. If we were using radioactive materials, we'd be talking about containment. In this case, we're really not so much, but you can kind of think about containment also as being, we're shielding the room so that we're not exposing people on the other side of the room. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So time, distance, and shielding. Reduce time, increase distance, and increase shielding in a reasonable manner. So how do we minimize our exposure? Remain in the operator's control location during your X-ray exposures. Don't step out of it. Wear a lead apron if you must be inside the room with the patient. Check your badge readings regularly. You should be wearing a personal dosimeter. Please check your readings. And if you're concerned about your exposure or your dose, you can contact a medical physicist to give you advice on this. So I just mentioned personal monitoring. So what is personal monitoring? It's to monitor and to maintain a permanent record of the occupational radiation exposure. We might change out dosimeters monthly or quarterly, and they're sent to an accredited laboratory. Reports are sent to facilities, and they're available for your review. And you should know where to be able to review that. And they are required for those that are likely to exceed 10% of the permissible level. So permissible level is 5,000 millirem a year. So if you're likely to exceed 500 or even get close to it, you need a badge. Some of you may not have personal dosimeters or badges, but some of you may. So we must be able to demonstrate you wouldn't get near 500 if you don't have one, but it's a good idea to have one, and you should always have one when starting out to find out what your dose risk is. So what are our limits again? So we have three things that we measure. We measure deep dose, which is a limit of 5,000 millirem a year, shallow dose, which would be skin dose, which is 50,000 millirem a year, and lens of eye dose, which is 15,000 millirem a year. The difference in those limits is based on the risk to a person from exposure to those tissues. And if we look at a report, you will see in there the person's name, the current month, the current quarter, the year-to-date dose for each of these three categories. Here's a little closer look at it. It's just a little bit of an eye chart, hard to read, but you can see if you look at look past the name and past the use, and you can see the dose equivalent in millirem. For the monitoring period, you'll see deep dose, eye dose, and shallow dose. Now for X-ray, those numbers come out about the same because X-ray is very penetrating and it delivers about the same amount of radiation to each of those tissues, except the eye dose might be a little less because it's such a low density tissue. And again, these are the occupational dose limits I mentioned before. Of these, the one that we're mostly concerned with X-ray in medical use is 5,000 millirem a year, whole body. That's a dose to our whole body from exposure to X-ray. And we should point out that the general public limit is 0.1 rem or 100 millirem. So it's much, much lower than an occupational worker. But because a member of the general public, and that does not include patients, has no way to protect themselves and is not trained in radiation safety, this is a lower limit so that we don't expose the general public. It's important to note that although there is risk from occupational exposure, the risk-benefit balance works too. The risk from radiation exposure in occupational settings should be no greater than the risk in any other safe environment, any other safe industry. And so this limit of 5,000 millirem is based on that equation. You should know that there should be an annual report to the employees if you get over 100 millirem annually, and you should be notified of that. And you should be available to you every year if you get over 100 millirem annually. If you don't see that, you probably didn't get over 100 millirem. And if you ever want to see your exposure, please talk to the person responsible for radiation in your facility. It should be important to note that if you're pregnant or trying to become pregnant, there should be a fetal monitoring program, which should be part of your radiation protection program, which is required by the IAC, and that your job duties may be changed or not changed depending on how you worked it out with your supervisor, but enrollment is voluntary. You do not have to be forced to be in the fetal program. We want to maintain fetal doses under 500 millirem for the pregnancy, which means about less than 50 millirem a month. And we'll usually look at action levels of 30 or 40 millirem, decide should we change job duties. Now, what about patient pregnancy? You should always ask a patient before a procedure, are you pregnant or might you be pregnant? So look for signs, post signs rather, that say if you're pregnant, notify the technologist. You should have a facility procedure written how you're going to deal with pregnant patients. You should document what you did for a pregnant patient and make sure that it's posted in other languages like the signs. And also in your policy, what you're going to do if the patient's unsure. Do you want to delay the test? Do you want to proceed with the test? Do you want to take a pregnancy test? What do you do in a case of emergency? You should address all these items, and it's different for different facilities. Let's talk really quick about protecting members of the general public. As users of CT, you will have to be sure that we're protecting members of the general public. The IAC requires a plan review or shielding design, which is a way of demonstrating by calculation that public dose limits met. It's required for many states, it's for all new X-ray rooms, and required by the IAC. So we take a look at what the spaces are around the room, how often people are there, and what dose we can expect to find there. If the dose results in over 100 milligram or close to 100 milligram, we will require some shielding to make sure we're well below that limit. Following the plan review and installation of the machine, we will do, and I will just point out these were examples of what a plan review might look like: pointing out the space, pointing out the wall, what shielding is required, an assumption of what your use factors are for the CT that was given by you to the physicist, and the shielding that is recommended by the physicist. Following the installation machine, the IAC requires, and many states require as well, an area radiation survey. In this case, a medical physicist will go out, they'll put a phantom in the machine, maybe for a cone beam CT, it might be a gallon of water. We might use a large body phantom for a multi-detector CT. We'll irradiate that as if we would a patient, and we'll take a very sensitive instrument and measure the amount of radiation around the room on the outside of the walls and the adjacent spaces for those test shots, and then we'll calculate based on the reading we got what the dose would be in the course of a year based on your use of that machine to a member of the general public. Let's talk a little bit about the units that describe CT dose to a patient. For multi-detector CTs, there's a descriptor that is called CTDI. It was never designed for cone beam CT, but your cone beam CT, if you have one, may give you that information. It is the dose to a cylindrical phantom, 16 or 32 centimeters in diameter, and it is, again, not patient dose. It is a descriptor that we can use to compare protocols, whether this one's higher or this one's lower at describing dose, and we can use that data as sort of a comparison of protocols. You may also see something called dose length product, or DLP. And DLP is really just the CTDI, volumetric CTDI index times the length irradiated. So if we, CTDI is for one slice, okay? How much dose to cylindrical phantom does one slice give? And then dose length product would be for the whole length of the scan. So if I have a longer scan, the CTDI is more. If I have a shorter scan, it's less. If I have a high pitch number in a helical system, the CTDI is, rather the DLP is lower because it's not as much densely radiating. If the pitch is 1 or less, which would mean that all the slices touch or overlap, then the dose length product is higher. So you may see a report like this on your CT dose page. It will give you an idea of what the CTDI vol is, the volumetric CTDI in milligray, and what the DLP is, and what the effective dose percentage is, and which phantom it was based on. So this one, the top one, was 52 images at 9.89 milligray, based on a 32 centimeter body phantom. It's very typical kind of a result that you might see. And if you look on a cone beam CT in this upper corner, you might see something like this. And it quotes a CTDIW, which is the weighted CTDI. And it might quote DAP, which is dose area product. And so that is increasingly used for cone beam CTs. And a CTDI is not used in general. And it's really not a good descriptor for cone beam because it was designed on a very narrow slice, and a cone beam is a much wider slice. And so, without getting into too much detail, it sort of changes the way we describe the dose. So let's talk about dose area product or Kerma-Area product. You may see both these things. It's used by some cone beam systems, especially those that are designed in Europe. And it really just says the area of the irradiated space in square centimeters, usually, times the dose, or Kerma, which is kinetic energy released in air. But so we will see milligray centimeter squared. It's the product, multiplying the area times the milligray. An interesting point about this is that the dose is the same at any point in the beam, because as the beam increases in size, the dose decreases by the same amount. In other words, with the square of the distance. So it's the same at any point. And it's a great unit to use. If you want to translate to another unit, you can contact your physicist. We can formulate comparisons to CTDI if we want to. Again, I've covered this already on effective dose. I don't think we need to go into it here, but realize that effective dose is calculated. It's not a measured quantity. If we see, we can take something like CTDI and determine an idea what effective dose is for that phantom. But again, it is by definition an estimate of the uniform whole body dose that would produce the same risk of an adverse effect as results from a non-uniform partial body irradiation. So we're just irradiating the head. It's not the same risk as irradiating the whole body, and this is a way of equating that. The risk of cancer induction does depend on the organ receiving the dose or the part of the body receiving the dose, and it's really just a comparison of risks that I mentioned before. How was it determined? It was determined using phantoms such as this. We would take like a rando phantom, and they would put TLDs and little chips like a personal dosimeter inside the head and irradiate it, and do this for different parts of the body to determine how much dose we would receive from a cone beam CT unit or from a CT unit, and then be able to correlate it. This is just a quick example of what sorts of things produce different doses. It's just an important thing that a multi-detector CT would result in much more dose than, say, a cone beam CT or a planar film. But the information that you receive from a multi-detector CT is greater than a cone beam CT. But a cone beam CT just may be all you need for one specific purpose. And then for a planar film, you get less information, but the dose is less too. Let's talk a little bit about a patient's questions about dose. Avoid technical answers. Emphasize the benefit versus the risk. Mention that we're using the least amount of radiation that we can to achieve the image quality we need to give you great care. If they ask about cone beam, realize that cone beam doses are much lower than whole body CT scanners, but it may not be appropriate for every purpose. A whole body medical multi-detector CT scanner may be a better choice for certain applications. And mention that you use board-certified medical physicists to measure and optimize your doses, as the IAC requires. And mention again that you're accredited by the IAC as well. It's important that you're accredited by a nationally recognized body. So in this talk, we covered the nature of radiation, some radiation terminology, some sources of radiation, biological effects of radiation risk and benefit, occupational exposure, personal monitoring, protection from radiation in pregnancy, and describing CT dose. A couple things that I want to point out for practical steps for CT safety. Double check the patient ID, always. Always make sure you're using the right test. Make sure the patient is carefully positioned so you don't have to repeat the study. Use dose reduction models and modes if available. So a lot of these systems have low dose modes, and they have maybe lower resolution modes if you don't need to use as much high resolution. Make sure your medical physicist weighs in on protocols. Check the CTDI or the DAP when it spits out at the end. Is it within the expected range? Use dose check if you're XR29 compliant. Now, cone beam CT is usually not XR29 compliant, but all MDCT should be. Everything built recently should be. Make sure you've got lead aprons available for use. Lock down your protocols. If they're variable, lock them down. Most cone beams are locked in. A multi-detector CT is not so much, but you can password protect them so that technologists cannot change them. Review protocols with your medical physicist and follow your QC program. Every machine has a recommended QC program. You should follow it religiously, and it will be required for IAC accreditation as well, that information. If you have questions, you can contact the IAC, of course. And if you contact the IAC and there's a question regarding something on medical physics, I'll be weighing in on it. And we've come to the end of the main part of the program, so we're going to have a question and answer session.
From IAC, I'd like to introduce Nancy Merrill, Director of Accreditation for CT, who will be assisting with questions today. Nancy, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you very much. So first of all, Bill, the first question is, since the IAC does require staff members who are being in an accredited facility to have 3 hours of radiation safety training, the question is the Landauer radiation safety training online process applicable just to technologists, or is that applicable to technologists and physicians?
It is applicable to technologists and physicians as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right, the next question is, does the use of contrast, either IV or oral, affect the amount of absorbed radiation by the body?
When you use contrast, you may vary your protocol for the contrast, so that will change the amount of absorbed radiation by the body. The contrast itself will absorb more radiation, but will not greatly affect an increase in dose unless you change the protocol to the body, with the exception of mentioning that, and a lot of people have gone to fewer and fewer with and without contrast protocols. But if you do the study twice, basically you've doubled the dose, or maybe just a little bit more. So, and if you have questions about that, we can you can forward them to myself, or we do have folks that just address protocols regarding the use of contrast or any sort of use of CT in general on protocols.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, the next question that I see is, can a CT scan interfere with an oncologist's usage of chemotherapy or radiation therapy, either before, during, or after these therapies?
Absolutely not. There's no reason that there should be any interaction there. The CT is used in treatment planning for cancer. It is a great tool to use for treatment planning because you get a nice 3D view of the body. And so an awful lot of patients undergoing chemotherapy receive that planning, or will have routine CTs to measure the effectiveness of chemotherapy. And so there's no reason for any concern about the use of CT in that treatment of that patient.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is, how can we check the CTDI for an appropriate level?
Okay, that's a great question, actually. There are benchmarks which are published by various bodies, including the ABR and by the ACR actually too, and there's next data that is published by the ACR. So basically, if you look at all the protocols around the whole country, let's say we looked at all the abdomens or all the head protocols, you would see a great distribution in the amount of radiation, but that it would look like a normal distribution. So it'd be a nice bell curve. We have outliers that are very high, which is probably excessive dose. We don't want to go there. And you have outliers that are very low, which is probably really poor image quality. We don't want to go there either. And that distribution is based on a lot of factors. It could be based on the kind of machine you have, the technology of the machine, whether it's a brand new machine that has iterative reconstruction or doesn't have iterative reconstruction, or might be a 4-slice unit versus a 132-slice unit. And so there's a lot of different factors that lie in there. But like the ACR will break it out and say into percentiles. And so you can look for any protocol and you can see, and these are published as well, what the and you can also contact us at Landauer Medical Physics, and this is not really a commercial, but we do help people with this and give them guideline doses, benchmarks to be aware of. And so, like, typically you want all your exposures to be below the 75th percentile, but also with a little bit of work, below the 50th percentile should be achievable. But we definitely want to be below that 75th percentile for any of these studies. And mostly you'll see that, you'll see those published as 75th percentile as the benchmark, and then the achievable level will be the 50th percentile for any dose. And you can join the ACR dose index registry and have access to all that data if you want to. I don't think it's very expensive. And you would basically import your data as well, so they have access to your data to that registry. And so thousands and thousands of CT users all around the country are in that. And that's kind of a nice way to do it. Us at Landauer, we keep our own directory as well. And we're also gaining thousands and thousands of users as well. And so we can help you with information specific to your scanner if you want it. So if you're using a certain make and model, we can say about where your protocol should be, what would be good protocols to use to achieve those dose limits, or benchmarks, really, guideline values.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, the next question is, how often does the IAC require a medical physicist to test the CT equipment?
Okay, so it's required that we test it annually, and we're testing it for a number of different parameters that are listed actually in the if you look at the CT information and the information from the IAC on CT accreditation, you can see what all those parameters are. And so, depending on your kind of machine, it might take around 2 hours or so to test all those things, but we will test them manually. And we're making sure that that the machine performs adequately when first installed, and that you're maintaining the image quality as you go through. Now, a physicist may recommend certain changes if we see the quality dropping off or it doesn't meet manufacturer specifications. So we would say, we might make recommendations for changes in, that you might get an engineer in to adjust some sort of protocol or something.
Okay, thank you very much. And just to let you all know that you can look in the IAC Standards Part B section, and that does have all the specific information.
Thanks.
All right, the next question is, what are your thoughts of combining different imaging modalities on the same day, such as nuclear medicine and CT?
For a specific reason that you have a patient in there, you should always use the most appropriate study. So, like, there might be situations like to rule out PE in a pregnant patient. There's a lot of talk back and forth, like, oh, should I use CT or should I use nuclear medicine? And so there's appropriateness criteria. You can look up on the web, and there's various tools that take you through appropriateness criteria for which study you should use, which one has the higher dose, which one has the best specificity, and things like that. So they're ranked. I would say for a particular issue, you should only really strive to use one modality. And that would be the best one. In my example, it so happens a dose to the fetus and the mother is about the same, whether you use nuclear medicine or CT. Most people will say, though, that CT produces a better image. And so, all things being equal, you would use the CT in this case. Unless, of course, you're looking at a patient that's very far along in their pregnancy, and you might be afraid that the fetus would be in the view of the CT, then you might say, well, I don't want to give the unborn child a lot of dose, so I'll use a nuclear medicine study instead. So those are the kind of things that go into that decision-making process. But you could, if you had different concerns about different kinds of diagnoses, you could mix modalities on the same day if you're looking at different things that might be wrong with the patient, different concerns about patient health. But on any one given concern, I would strive for the most appropriate modality.
Okay, and I'm going to give you the one last question, and that is, should the staff radiation exposure monitoring badges be only supplied to the technologists, or should they be given to other staff members that are maybe close to the CT suite?
It's a great question, and one that a lot of people struggle with. And so anybody who is frequents the CT suite or is in there a lot, there might be a nurse or other staff member that is on call for a CT, or might have to be in the room with the patient. but I would limit it to clinical personnel who are in close proximity to the CT when in operation. And if there's anybody you're unsure of, and sometimes staff gets nervous about their radiation dose, I've even had receptionists get nervous about their dose. Well, there's a CT in the office. Should I have a badge? I recommend this. It doesn't cost a lot to badge somebody for a little while and just to prove to them that they're not receiving any measurable dose. And a lot of people that may be in close proximity, you might want to badge a few of them and say, okay, we did it for 6 months and you have no dose that's measurable. Clearly, you're not going to need a monitoring badge because you won't go over 500. We don't even see anything here. And that's usually what you'll find. You could take those badges away at that point, since their fears would be reduced greatly. They probably wouldn't be worried about it anymore. They might think, well, this is more trouble than it's worth. But you will find that you'll probably be down to just the technologists that are operating the CT in that case, or maybe a radiologist or whoever the medical director at your facility is.
Okay, thank you very much. Kelly?
Okay, great. Thanks again, everyone, and a very special thank you to our guest presenter, Bill DeForest. Please feel free to contact IAC with any questions that were not answered during the Q&A session. To receive continuing education credit for attending this webinar, please complete the survey. The survey will appear on your screen automatically at the conclusion of this live session and also be available from the IAC webinars portal for 3 business days. On the left side of the My Account page, you'll click on Webinars, look for the title of this session, Introduction to CT Radiation Safety. Beneath this title, you will see the button Attend Event. Click this button, then the Evaluation tab, then click Take Evaluation to complete the survey. Your certificate can then be accessed and printed from the very next screen and any time thereafter through the CE transcript section on the My Account page. If you have any questions about the survey, please contact us at webinars@intersocietal.org. Once again, we thank you for joining us today and appreciate your participation.